When it comes to John Mayer's gear, there is one era in particular that we know relatively little about what pedals John actually had with him out on tour. And of course, I'm talking about the Heavier Things era. But why is it that the Heavier Things era has always been such a mystery when it comes to the pedals that John had with him? Now, when you think of the Heavier Things era, think 2003 into 2004, right before the John Mayer Trio ever became a thing. And John actually transitioned from using a standard pedal board setup to a custom audio electronics switching system, and all of the pedals were off in a rack unit. So in any of the footage we have from this era, you can't tell what the labels were on the switcher, obviously, and there were really no great photos of the rack unit either, so you really couldn't tell what actually was inside of it to kind of try and piece together, all right, you can see that pedal there, so that obviously he was using, and maybe that looks like this pedal, so that's probably what it was. We were able to just do none of that. So as far as John's gear was concerned, the pedals for the Heavier Things era was just kind of a mystery that we had only bits and pieces of to really give us any indication of what John had on tour until now. I'm very excited to share with you all a full rig breakdown as far as the pedals that John had during the Heavier Things era. It's just incredibly interesting because there's a lot of pedals that we never even knew John was testing out in a capacity like using on tour on a regular basis. So let's get right on into the full pedal breakdown of the gear John had with him during the Heavier Things era. The fact that we now know what pedals John had during this era almost 20 years later is just wild to me, and it's all thanks to a really obscure Japan exclusive magazine that was published in April of 2004 that actually had this full-on rig rundown and even the only real shot we have of John's rack unit around this time, and it's thanks to Matt, who is Moose Guitars on Instagram, another really big John Mayer fan, who stumbled upon this magazine and then translated the magazine article in Japanese for us to share today. So Matt, thank you so much for sharing this and sending these images over for me to use in this video. Absolutely wild, and I'm really going to try and track down this magazine to have an actual hard copy of it myself, because it's just really cool as really the only documentation we have of the Heavier Things era gear. Alright, so now what we are going to do is run through all of the different pedals from this rundown that were in the rack unit at this time, and of course provide some commentary on some pedals that we kind of safely assumed John would be using around this point, and also a lot of new gear that we had no idea he was experimenting with at all, which is the coolest part out of all of this. So the very first pedal is the Marshall Bluesbreaker Mark I. We knew John was experimenting with the Marshall Bluesbreaker kind of around this time, of course, it being really used during the Continuum era, but the kind of initial Bluesbreaker addition into John's gear arsenal occurred around this time, we knew. So really cool to see absolute confirmation that John was using it for the Heavier Things tour. The next pedal is another drive pedal, and it is the Fulltone Full Drive 2. Now, in the actual shot of John's rack unit here, you can see that it is one of those red and white kind of custom shop units, it looks like. We know John was using one of the blue ones kind of originally as well, but in this specific rig rundown, he had one of those red custom shop versions as well. And just another pedal that he really was using instead of a tube screamer at the time. John's mentioned that the Fulltone is just a really great kind of take on the tube screamer sound and a good substitute. Then of course John would transition into using the Keeley modded TS-808 as well as a vintage TS-808 are kind of around this time, mainly leading into the John Mayer Trio era, but that was the main drive setup combination for the tour at this specific time: Marshall Bluesbreaker and Fulltone Full Drive 2. Now the next pedal, well, it's not really a pedal, it's a piece of rack gear, is the Line 6 Echo Pro, and this is the first one that we really didn't know that John was using at all. And I've done just a little bit of digging into the Echo Pro, and there are a few different modeler models that it has that I thought were worth mentioning in the video. It's got the EP1 and EP3 Echoplexes, the Roland RE101 Space Echo, it has the Boss DM2 analog delay, as well as the Electro-Harmonix Deluxe Memory Man. Now, one just little theory I've had as a result of this is that because the Echo Pro has a Boss DM2 model in it, it kind of made me think that the Boss DM2 is not worlds apart from those original Way Huge Octopuses that we know John would begin to start using somewhat around this time, for sure during the John Mayer Trio era in 2005. And maybe just maybe, he had one of the switches on the Bradshaw system to kind of do the Boss DM2 sort of thing as a slapback, and kind of his first maybe experimentation with that slapback sound, which then of course would lead into him using the Way Huge Octopus really for the remainder of his career at the time of me making this video. Just a theory I had around the Line 6 Echo Pro that I thought was kind of cool and maybe something John possibly was doing. The next pedal is another delay pedal, and it is the Electro-Harmonix Deluxe Memory Man. I feel like everyone at one point or another has used a Memory Man, and now we can add John to that list as well. Obviously the Deluxe Memory Man probably taking on a very kind of main component of John's delay sounds at that time, I would assume. Up next is actually our third and final delay effect, and it is a Carl Martin delay-la. Now, in this magazine article, it doesn't specify in saying that it is the XL version, so I believe this would just be the standard delay-la. This pedal is very interesting as well because it's kind of a vintage echo simulator pedal, very reminiscent of the Pete Cornish TES and kind of look and vibe almost slightly to me, and I think that maybe this was kind of John experimenting with those really beautiful echo sounds. Of course, then moving on to the T-Rex replica, and then of course the Pete Cornish TES for kind of those typical quintessential John Mayer delay sounds, really. So this might be kind of an early look at a pedal that John was using for some of those delay sounds, and this is actually one that's on this list that I'm very curious about, and I might have to just try out for myself. But that rounds out 3 different delay effects that John was using and experimenting with at this time. Up next, we have the Fulltone Super Trem, and this is another pedal that we didn't know John was using live. And trem really isn't an effect that you might not think of when it comes to John's sound. However, trem is just a very fundamental component of the tone of gravity, and John's only really relied on 2 different trem effects for gravity. One being, of course, the Victoria Reverberato, as well as the Strymon Flint, and John kind of experimenting with the different modes on the Strymon Flint. Now we can add this Fulltone Super Trem to the list of trem effects John has used live, although we did know that John did have it in his collection back on Snapchat. Years ago now, John actually posted a photo saying, "Need any pedals?" And on the shelf unit, kind of in storage, maybe in the studio or somewhere, wherever he was taking the photo, you actually can see the Fulltone Super Trem sitting there. Just a really cool kind of fact I thought I'd throw in regards to this one pedal. Moving on now, we are going to talk about compression, and John actually had 2 different compressor pedals in the rack unit. The very first one being the Carl Martin compressor and limiter, then the next one being the T-Rex Comp Nova. And the Comp Nova, you can actually see in that shot of his rack unit, and just based on the time that this rig breakdown was done, as well as just in the photo, you can tell that it is one of those early ones with the T-Rex specific logo, that original T-Rex logo with literally a T-Rex on it, on the bottom kind of left of the pedal. So just giving you guys an indication of the exact model of Comp Nova John was using. And then of course you have that Carl Martin compressor and limiter as well. It's kind of cool that he had a couple different compressor pedals that, again, we just never knew he had ever used before. So if you're looking at a new compressor pedal, maybe 2 other options for you to check out. Okay, so it's at this point here now, we only have 2 more pedals to discuss, and both of these were very safe bets, if not almost guarantees, when it comes to the gear John would be using at this time, and you'll see why in a second. So the very first one is the Hughes & Kettner Tube Rotosphere. This was one that we could safely assume John was probably using, as he had used this during the Room for Squares era for his kind of Leslie sounds. And then of course the next one being the Roger Lynn Adrenaline, the very first one. This one was an absolute given because of course off of Heavier Things we have Bigger Than My Body being the very first of 3 songs that John wrote the guitar parts with, really relying on the Roger Lynn Adrenaline to create those tones. Of course, Bigger Than My Body with the Roger Lynn Adrenaline 1. You have I Don't Trust Myself with Loving You with the Roger Lynn Adrenaline 2. Then of course Born and Raised Paradise Valley era to present days actually with the Qtron Plus. Then we have Heartbreak Warfare with the Roger Lynn Adrenaline 3. So the Adrenaline 1 was just an absolute guarantee. If he's performing Bigger Than My Body, he had to have that specific pedal to be able to perform that song properly like the studio version. And there you guys go. That rounds out the entire rack breakdown as far as all the effects that John was using during the Heavier Things era in early 2004. Again, absolute shout out to Matt at Moose Guitars for stumbling upon this. This is just awesome to actually finally be able to kind of put the final piece of the puzzle more or less into at least knowing one full kind of tour's worth of effects that John was using for this time point. Now we actually have kind of a full look at all of the gear John was using pedal-wise throughout his entire career. Of course, he might have been experimenting and probably was experimenting with different pedals during the Heavier Things era. However, at least we have one complete look at a shot in time, early 2004, at what John was using. So we at least have one indicator, which is really awesome, and I just was very excited to just see this. And now it's like, all right, there's a couple different pedals that I think I might want to check out, like that Carl Martin Delayla. I think that could be a sleeper pedal when it comes to trying to emulate those Pete Cornish TES delay sounds like were used on Where the Light Is in the Continuum era, because that pedal is just the definition of unobtainium when it comes to not only John's gear, but just pedals in general. So that might be a really good option even as a substitute to something like the Delay 80s. So that's one I'm very curious to try out, as well as the T-Rex Comp Nova. I really like the T-Rex replica, and the T-Rex brand in general is pretty cool. So that might be a cool compressor pedal to try out as well. Let me know your guys' thoughts on these different pedals that John had, especially the new ones that we really didn't know that John was using. Have you ever had any first-hand experience with them? Let me know your thoughts on any of them if you have in the comments down below. And as always, guys, thank you so much for watching today's video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Just something very interesting, like I said. Really cool to now kind of have a bit more of a complete picture on John's pedal kind of timeline. Till the next video, guys, thanks again for watching. Take care. We'll see you on the next one.
Anyway, go ahead and click the subscribe button if you like what you see.